Welcome. I'm Sam Faddis. This is Ground Truth, and this is the second of a three-part series that we're doing focusing on organ harvesting in China. And with us, the guest that we're going to have throughout this and had in our first segment, Ethan Gutman, who I don't know is maybe the best guy on the planet to talk about this issue. He is the author of a book on the topic called "The Slaughter," a Nobel Prize nominee, a fellow for China research at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, co-founder of the International Coalition to End Transplant Abuse in China. You know, I could go on with that bio for some time, but I think the thing that I would point out that's probably obvious to everybody that's listened to the first segment is that in a world that seems to be increasingly filled with people who opine on things based simply on having read what somebody else wrote about it, Ethan is a guy who actually does his research, does his work, gathers the facts, does the investigative, well, puts in the time and the effort and the energy to actually find out what's going on. So this is a guy who's telling you what's real. Ethan, thank you for coming on again.
Thank you very much, Sam. That's a very nice introduction.
Well, I mean it. I talk to a lot of people, and I also do a lot of writing myself, and increasingly I find it hard to find folks who can actually tell you something other than what they learned by reading what somebody else said about it. The whole concept of people actually going out and speaking to people on the ground and doing investigations like you have done and finding the truth in the first place, that's increasingly rare. But we set the stage in the first segment, sort of talking about the three parts, well, the not just the three segments of the podcast, if you will, but that these correspond to almost three separate eras. I mean, that's my verbiage, not yours, but there's a process of evolution as this whole organ harvesting thing changes over time. At the end of the first episode segment that we did, we were somewhere late 90s, and things had begun substantially, to my verbiage again, to enlarge and change, and the nature and the scope of what was going on with organ harvesting in China really began to alter, at least in my opinion. So can you pick up the narrative there? Or where are we and what
I
happens
guess I can. I
next?
mean, the issue here, partly in my mind, I'll just tell you, this is sort of my commentary, and I don't have some actual document pointing to this or anything, or even exactly an interview. Although I did do some interviews with people who, of course, worked in the 610 office, which was a organization that was set up to go after Falun Gong, and it had extra powers that nobody else in law enforcement had, and better computers and all that kind of thing. They hinted at the guy I interviewed for quite some time hinted at this, but I do believe that even Communist Party states have inhibitions. Okay, I think one of the things that I find a little difficult in my field is that there's a tendency to sort of, I don't know, I heard a comparison saying, communists are a Satanist or something recently, and I was just like, well, no, that's not true, really. In fact, if you're a communist, you believe you're doing the right thing. You believe there is a fairer way for the world to work, and then you're working towards that. You have to have some kind of inner belief to even get involved, or even to fake getting involved, just to do it for your own career. So I think it's important to recognize that they have inhibitions too. And one of the things that we see in organ harvesting 1.0, as I call it, which is the Uyghurs in northwest China, is that breaks down over time. In other words, you first start doing live organ harvesting of prisoners, and then you move into actually doing political prisoners. These are people, and the difference here is that this is now not really tied to the law anymore. Very few Uyghurs were actually sentenced to death. There were occasionally terrorists, like outright terrorists, who put bombs on buses and things like that. And they were condemned to death. But most Uyghurs who were in captivity didn't have that nature. I mean, it wasn't even a full out IRA kind of situation. I mean, they'd had some involvement with other people who'd done violence in some cases, but most of them had not actually done anything that even by Chinese law could lead them to death row. Yeah. So I think that's a critical thing, is that once they start exploiting political prisoners or even religious prisoners, because to a certain extent this is a bias against Muslims, and to some extent they're racial prisoners, because this is a huge bias towards Uyghurs, which are not ethnically Chinese and don't even look that like Chinese people really, and they certainly speak a very different language. And in fact, genetically they're quite different than Han Chinese. All right, all these things together, long story short, they have broken their own, whatever taboos or restrictions existed have been broken. By 1997, Communist Party cadres are coming and collecting organs from political prisoners, and those political prisoners are being put to death, on order for these cadres, right? It's very significant, big change, and that's an opening. Now, what's interesting is that, as you said, we left off about 1998, and one of the people who's working on this is a young doctor whose name, I call him Murat in the book, okay? And Murat, he has family in China, so we can't reveal his real name. Murat, his impression was, after 2 go-rounds with these high-ranking Chinese Communist Party officials coming to Urumqi, staying in a fancy hotel, and waiting for their organs, which are then harvested on their behalf, and then they go home, right? His impression was this wasn't going to continue, that this was a temporary phenomenon, that it was something that came out of this conflict in Gulja and the conflict with the Uyghurs, but now the Uyghurs had settled down again, and perhaps that was the end of it. Or at least that's how he kind of rationalized it to himself. In other words, I'm not responsible for some great crime. I'm responsible for something that was kind of like a wartime situation. Yeah? All right. The problem then is that in 1999, we have the largest action of scale by the Chinese security forces since the Cultural Revolution, which is the persecution of Falun Gong. You can call it the elimination of Falun Gong. If you want to use another expression, that's fine, whatever. We don't have to use highly emotional expressions here. But persecution works pretty well, because this is one of the biggest and the biggest things China's ever seen. And of course, the majority of my book, which, as you pointed out, did take quite some time, because I interviewed over 100 people for it, and that part took about 7 years, and it was mostly Falun Gong in that. And I was trying to get very close to the coalface there and really find out a couple of things. I wanted to know who Falun Gong was. I wanted to know not so much, I didn't want to judge it as a religion or make, that wasn't the point of what I was writing. My point was to fill in something that nobody had done, which was the comprehensive history of the conflict between the Chinese state and this group called Falun Gong. That had never been done. And there are many reasons why it had never been done, mainly to do with writers from China not wanting to cut off their access. I didn't have to worry about that, because I'd already written a book about China, which had cut off my access earlier. And so I had my burn notice in hand.
Right.
And I could go right ahead. Now, at this point, I'd really like to open it up to you, Sam, because I'm really interested in what you, as an intelligence, I mean, I've had conversations back then, I remember, with a fellow I knew in the CIA, and he sort of said, oh, well, why are you even doing this? Falun Gong's a cult. And I said, well, that's not what my research is telling me, but okay. So I'm really interested in your perspective as an intelligence veteran, what your interests are in this, because it's a big topic. We're now into big canvas stuff when we get into organ harvesting 2.0.
Right. Well, one of the things that I found, I mean, I find everything that you're laying out on this subject to be fascinating. I mean, I thought I knew a fair amount about it before you and I started talking, and like with a lot of subjects, I realized how little I knew. But one of the things that you said that I thought was really insightful a few minutes ago was talking about, the fact that people do in fact have limits even in communist regimes. I mean, I think this is certainly true when you look at the history of, like, say, a Nazi regime, right? It gets really easy afterward to just say, well, everybody in the Third Reich was a Nazi and they were all evil and they were all into herding people into gas chambers. And without attempting to minimize in any sense the horror of the Holocaust, the fact of the matter is that we know that along the way there are a lot of people who have a lot of misgivings and would and that's really the horror in some ways, is that average people who aren't really animals or monsters
Mm,
end up then doing monstrous things. They go along, they rationalize, where they're put, and that to me in any regime has always been one of the truly terrifying things. You're not, so you could literally have millions of people who acquiesce in doing horrible things because they're all doing this. Well, they're all rationalizing. But back to your question. As we come to the time period where we are now, and we begin talking about Falun Gong from the Chinese Communist Party standpoint, if that's the right way to phrase this, from the
mm,
standpoint of the state, what's the primary driving motive for doing this? I mean, there are a lot of ways to
mm,
oppress and kill and abuse people that are much more straightforward, like just shooting them in the head and bulldozing them into mass graves. So what's driving this focus on organ harvesting?
right,
Is this
right, and
money?
this
Is
is
that what we're talking about?
this is the central question, and I actually don't believe that it was initially money, though I think these things. One of the things that does make it a little more complicated is, and I tried to document this in the book, is that these things change over time, and often the original cause of the persecution uh, becomes divorced from the original. It becomes divorced from the original cause and becomes something else over time. And academics like to call this an action-reaction phenomena, but I think that kind of clouds it. I think it's that simple, that over time there's a development, right? In the beginning, there's no question. I mean, I can just lay it down really easily, which is, you know, my working definition of Falun Gong, and it's purely my own, is that this is a Buddhist revival group. Okay, uh, and it's very similar to the tent cities in the Midwest in America or something like that. All right, it's bringing back, in some ways, the old time religion, right, of what Buddhism was in China. Okay, it's a simplified version, as the tents as revivalist movements are. It's a somewhat simple and more populist kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of feel to it, right? That's what this is. It is not. It's actually not a cult, because I've spent a lot of time around Falun Gong, and they argue all the time about even what was the definition of Falun Gong. They can't give you that definition that I just gave you. They argue about it too much, right? There be Everybody has a different view. One of the things that marked Falun Gong out was that anybody, and you see this today in the cities that you live in, if you've ever run across Falun Gong demonstrations, they're actually often some little old lady who's just sitting there with some banners and some maybe books, maybe my book even there, and they're, you know, trying to get people to sign a petition or trying to raise their awareness in some way. Nobody's told them to do that. Okay, they simply become inspired to do that, and they go out and do it, right? And sometimes this has led to pretty bad effects in Western societies, because it's not nobody's focus group these things. Okay, uh, and there's not a lot of money behind it. All right, that's the and you could see that, by the way, in Falun Gong media for many years. What is the offense from the Chinese perspective? It's basically that they're too big. That's number one, right? They're 70 million by the definition by the 610 offices, in internal documentation, they said there are at least 70 million Falun Gong in China in 1999. And they've started in 92, so that's a very rapid rise, yes? And that means that basically everybody in China knows somebody who's Falun Gong. Now, the Communist Party is only 65 million at that time, so they already have more people than the Communist Party. And they're an unauthorized group, okay, because they never were officially recognized, partly because there wasn't enough money changing hands, and so they couldn't get bribes out of them, right? Other groups, other religious groups, there's many Qigong groups in China, they played ball with the authorities. Their spiritual master, Li Hongzhi, did not particularly play ball. In fact, he moved to America in 1995, 1996, so that he wouldn't be the issue anymore, right? So that Falun Gong, he thought if he moved to America, he'd sort of get out of the way and the Chinese authorities would stop doing heavy surveillance on them. That didn't work. In fact, this thing's been building for a while. And then there are other arguments that it was Jiang Zemin's particular interest. Okay, so the supreme leader in China at the time is Jiang Zemin. That's his particular interest. I don't tend to buy into that theory so heavily because that's something that the Chinese, they say that, the Communist Party is kind of like your mother and your father when you're living in China. And there's a tendency to sort of say there's a good parent and a bad parent. So if the Communist Party makes a mistake, it's not the whole family isn't tainted. It's just one parent's kind of made a mistake. That's the way people think about it. The truth is, Jiang Zemin definitely did see this as an issue for him, but the other people in the Central Committee either play neutral, and there's no advocate for Falun Gong in the Central Committee. So this decision is being made behind closed doors. Now, the other aspect to it is not just that it's big, it's also that Falun Gong differentiates itself from other Qigong groups or even religious groups out there because it's very ethical, right? It's the whole thing that just kept them completely different from the other groups was they were pushing the ideas of truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. Those are the three principles. And people really, really do try to live by these if they're Falun Gong. They're very sincere about it. These are values that are not, they don't fit with the new China. They don't fit with an expanding China which is going to rule the world. They are principles which seem weak to Communist Party officials, almost feminine. And so the feeling was that this was something terribly out of step with the new China and therefore dangerous. And the other final thing was, and this is often disregarded as a theory, but I certainly felt it when I was in China at the time. I remember my boss, Peter Beatty, sort of saying, oh, well, you have this huge security apparatus, and sometimes you have to flex the muscles, right? Or the muscles will atrophy, right? And that's what this is. And there's a final theory, which is also kind of interesting. I think you'll find this one particularly interesting. Jiang Zemin, and I got this from a man who was a economic minister and had defected to Australia, and I can't give his name, but I spent some time with him. He was very critical of me, very critical of my work, thought I was kind of a stupid Westerner, but he was unbelievably candid as well. And he said, not only did he know that the Falun Gong was going to be persecuted back, 2-3 years before it actually happened, but he also said he knew why. And the reason was that Jiang Zemin could not escape the legacy of Tiananmen Square, right? So that was something that was haunting Chinese politics. We don't perceive it that way in the West, but internally it was. And there's some evidence, kind of on the ground evidence that this is true. It's not something you can really capture in a survey, but the legacy of this terrible event and the destruction, elimination of the students, the shooting of them, and then the prison sentences and so forth. Jiang Zemin could not get away from this. And one thing he could do was change the subject, right? And I think that issue comes up again and again. And so it is possible that if you look at it from sort of from the Communist Party's inner logic, this was the way you changed the subject. You opened up a fresh can of worms. I mean,
Right.
I know it seems illogical, maybe a bit illogical to us, but that is the Communist Party thinking, is to launch, if you have a problem, launch a new campaign, right? Create a new enemy, create a new struggle.
So what does this translate into concretely in terms of what they do to Falun Gong?
Well,
What is that? What is that? What do they start doing to these people?
well, they ramp it up. I mean, basically, there's a little incident. There's sort of test things being run in the papers, sort of saying, Falun Gong is superstitious. It's a creepy group. It's not a righteous path. It's a twisted path. And people are writing this, and Falun Gong is getting indignant about it. And so they'll go and for example, they go and stand out in front of the Beijing TV. Beijing TV makes some statements. They stand out in front of Beijing TV. They eventually get an apology from Beijing TV. Oh, we'll correct that report. They go to Tianjin, which is close to Beijing, where an article has been written, there's a reason why they're doing this, because when you see that in China, when somebody writes an article like this, it's pretty serious. It means something's happening, and you have a choice. You can either do nothing and get crushed, or you can stand up and probably get crushed too. But at least you've stood up, and that's what Falun Gong did. So they went and had a silent demonstration at this, basically outside of this university, and the police broke it up. That was the first time there was violence. They came in, they started literally splitting heads. I know I interviewed a policeman who was there and who was part of it. And the Falun Gong, as people were being arrested, they sort of went to the police and said, look, what do we do? What are we supposed to do here? How do we get these people free? And they said, you can't do this locally. You have to go to Beijing. You have to go to the National Appeals Office in Beijing. And they have to hear you, because the National Appeals Office is the only place in China where a Chinese citizen can legally complain about their government. Okay? Now, the National Appeals Office, this is all very complicated, but the National Appeals Office is located in kind of these alleyways just outside of Zhongnanhai, the very center of Beijing, the leadership center, right next to the Forbidden City. And on April 25th, they go. About 10,000 go and appear at the National Appeals Office, except it's closed. In fact, it's kind of gone. It sort of disappears for the day. And instead, it's used as a photo op for the Chinese Communist Party to say, look, they're surrounding the leadership center of Zhongnanhai, and they photograph everybody and they document it all. Now, nothing happens. It's a completely silent demonstration. There's no violence. There's no signs. There's nothing. But the fact is, it's portrayed in the Chinese press as something that appeared out of nowhere, that nobody knew what was going to happen. That's crap. Okay, I've interviewed people who said that the Public Security Bureau of China had Falun Gong practitioners inside, and they literally came by and delivered letters 2 days and the night before, sort of saying this is going to happen, right? In fact, it was well known, and there were Falun Gong practitioners, at least one of the wives at the very highest levels of the party, and I'm not supposed to say which one, so I won't say which one. But the point is, this was well known ahead of time. There was nothing secret about it. The response, though, is to then set up. That's when Jiang Zemin made his move. He says we have to crush this group, and By June 10th, he creates the 610 office, which is this special agency, which is to do nothing but take out Falun Gong. However, the assumption, and by the way, the assumption is they can do this in about 2-3 months, because that's how it worked with other groups. They cut off the head, they go after the leadership, and then the group falls apart. Yeah. So then by July 20th, the persecution starts. And it starts with the arrest of supposed leadership of Falun Gong. It's not clear that they're actually leaders, but that's another story. That's met with a few demonstrations outside of Zhongnanhai. I witnessed those. At least I witnessed the end of those. I witnessed a lot of old ladies being thrown into buses and being driven off to big stadiums, which were used as clearinghouses. However, these demonstrations go on. They're not exactly demonstrations. Again, Falun Gong will just sort of show up at the town hall all over China, and they're taken away. They're processed, they're looked at, they're told to go home and stop practicing Falun Gong. That's all that happens initially. Over time, this becomes a lot more serious over that fall. So the fall of 1999, it becomes clear that Falun Gong are not going to go away quietly. They're not going to go away easily. They keep reappearing. They keep reappearing at the National Appeals Office, which is now open again. And they're arrested. They write out long statements, they're arrested. They write letters to the newspaper, they're arrested. They go out and start demonstrating in Tiananmen Square, and then they're arrested en masse. So what you have is these massive, massive arrests all over the country. Pretty much anyone who was Falun Gong, the majority of Falun Gong, went out and demonstrated at this point. You know? And many of them it was sort of a catch and release system, and they went home, and many of them just simply stopped practicing. But there was a hardcore group of, I don't know, approximately 5 million, something like that, who just kept at it, right? By December 1999, the first deaths. Initially, it's a young woman who was kind of the escape artist of the Falun Gong. She was amazing at escaping police custody. She did it again and again. The last time she did it, I believe it was the fourth time, where she escapes police custody. She jumps off a speeding train. They let her use the bathroom. She climbs out that window. She jumps. She does not live. She breaks her neck, I guess. And it's quite tragic. This fed into the propaganda surrounding Falun Gong, which was everywhere at the time. I mean, you couldn't escape it. Living in China, that's all I heard was this endless propaganda about Falun Gong. And part of the claim was that these people were suicidal, that they didn't go to doctors, that they were completely irrational, and that, you know, in this case, her death was even used in that same format to say she killed herself. In December, though, we get the worst news. There's of an old lady who's forced to walk in the snow in a labor camp, and who dies of exposure. And that was really, December is a cold month, but that was a chilling story. And that was around the time in Beijing where some Westerners even started to go, wait a minute, this has really gone too far. Something's happening here. And what was happening was the repression of Falun Gong was spinning out of control. And I don't have an absolutely clear explanation for that, except that Falun Gong was people really believed in what they believed, and they were willing to put down their lives. So this thing was a little bit like was suddenly starting to resemble the Spanish Inquisition. It had created its own momentum. The state now, there was a loss of face, potentially, for the state if they were to call this thing off or work out a deal of some kind. In fact, there's some evidence they even tried to, that they sent some emissaries. The Chinese Communist Party sent some emissaries over to America to try to talk to Li Hongzhi, this spiritual master. And his answer was, if you want to persecute, persecute. If you don't want to persecute, don't persecute. In other words, no deal. I think it's kind of significant. That does separate out Falun Gong from many other groups at the time, who were, or other religious groups who'd appeared, or Qigong groups, who were willing to make a deal, willing to find a way to work with the Communist Party. And you can make of that what you will, and people can second guess Li Hongzhi's decision all they like. I don't believe, and I've studied this for years, I don't believe I'm in a position to do that. Okay? I don't believe I'm in a position to applaud it or to reject it. And I'm going to leave that one alone. I'm just going to say that was the development of this thing, this thing that was happening. What I don't think people understood, I'm not sure anyone understood, was how serious this was going to become. In other words, you had torture being used very effectively in the prisons, in the Laogai system, including that black jails, detention centers, long-term detention centers, mental hospitals, and, of course, labor camps. And a lot of that torture was meted out by other prisoners. That is, the regular prisoners were given carte blanche to torture and humiliate Falun Gong practitioners, right? But what was happening was, it turned out that there was a very small minority of Falun Gong, but significant minority, who could not be tortured to the point where they would sign statements rejecting Falun Gong, claiming that they loved the Chinese Communist Party, and they wouldn't rat on their friends. In other words, they wouldn't give names of other Falun Gong practitioners. So that was a fairly significant shift, and that hadn't happened in Chinese recent history for, as far as I understand it, for some time. You understand what's building here is a kind of martyrdom, right, on the Falun Gong side. And you know, Sam, that martyrdom is the most powerful force in Chinese history. Leave aside Chinese Communist Party. Chinese history is, the martyrs are usually the ones who win, right? You see it over and over again in Chinese history. And this looked, from the Chinese Communist Party perspective, I'm sure that did not escape them, that the increasingly Falun Gong were looking like the virtuous group here. So that's when it really starts to spin out, and that's when we start getting the first signs. We had two things happen simultaneously at the end of the year 2000. One is Falun Gong are showing up en masse in Tiananmen Square every day and getting arrested, right? And they keep coming in. They're coming in from all the different provinces. There's various safe houses. I document this heavily in my book. I talked to somebody who ran one of the, I believe it's 8 or 9 safe houses in Beijing. And these people, when they're ready, they go off to Tiananmen Square, unfurl a banner, or pass out leaflets, and they get arrested. And they go off to labor camp, and they're never seen again. And that is happening on a massive scale. It's happening every day, and it's completely unplanned, but it's happening at all hours. At the same time, the first signs of organ harvesting start appearing right around then. Initially, it's just medical examinations, usually of women who are in the camps or in detention centers. And the Chinese authorities are incredibly nervous about this. They actually have one case, they have 2 guards for every woman, 2 armed guards, to bring them into an examining room where they're, given a blood test. Their eyes are looked at for the cornea, the health of the corneas. There's a urine test, there's an EKG, and there's a lot of probing of the abdomen. This is the basic organ test. They're not really interested in the person's health, they're interested in the health of the organs. But they're very tense about this. And In fact, they're so tense about it that it kind of worked. I mean, a lot of Falun Gong practitioners who were very early candidates for organ harvesting and witnessed disappearances, or at least were aware of disappearances in their own cell blocks, right? Suddenly, other young Falun Gong practitioners going missing in the middle of the night and that kind of thing. They did not recognize what they were being tested for. And I think that's you can go back. That certainly was true in the Holocaust. That many of the Jews, and I don't know about the Romanis, but I think that was probably true among them as well, did not believe that they were just going to be gassed. In this case, the Falun Gong were not seeing it. It wasn't like everybody was disappearing. It was like some people were disappearing, right? And they were all getting the exams, right? There was some loose talk that maybe this was about organ harvesting, but it was nothing more than a rumor.
So
So
what is the scale at this point in time where we are in the narrative?
yeah.
What so how many people? I'm not asking for an exact
Okay.
number, obviously, but what are we talking about? Are we talking about hundreds, thousands, millions?
No. We're talking about a couple of million in the end of 2000 and into 2001.
Good God.
A couple of million Falun Gong. At the one point, I mean, if the Laogai system as a whole in China is approximately 5 million people, that was always Harry Wu's estimate. And, it's not based on exact science, but it was based on the closest you could come to that, was just he actually counted all the nodes. He looked at every place which was labor camp and was producing mountain bikes, and he kind of did it by economic output, which was an intelligent way to do it. And he came up with this number of approximately 4 to 5 million people being detained in China at any given time. At one point in the very beginning of this thing, in 2000, 2001, the persecution starts in 99. By 2000, 2001, you're looking at something where the Falun Gong was about half of that entire population, very briefly. It doesn't last that long. A lot of those people get processed out. A lot of them don't have that long sentences. A lot of the people just simply sign the statements, give up, go home. Some of them then go off back to practicing Falun Gong, but they maybe do it quietly, or even if they do it, they get caught again. There's all kinds of ways that people handle this. But we can say it's about that. My feeling is that about 2002, and I don't have this on, what I have, this is just based on witness interviews and their approximations. They obviously have no way of knowing how much of the Laogai system they constituted or how many were in the camps at any time. But they could estimate how many were in their cell block, and that's what I asked them for. It's like, how many people are in your cell block, how many people are Falun Gong? And over time, you see a change. And it shifts to, there are approximately 1 million out of that 5 million. And there, or 500,000 later on. So it's between 500,000 to 1 million. There's always a high estimate and a low estimate. That's the way I work. And it's a fairly sizable population. It tends to be a little bit more women than men, and so forth. So they're very much dominating the women's prisons and not so much dominating the men's prisons, the men's detention. Yeah. Numbers are complicated here, but that's the best numbers. I've worked very hard on those to make them fair and what I think are reasonable.
So how many of these people are then ending up being killed and having their organs harvested?
Well, it's not actually that much. I mean, what I came out with eventually was that from year 2000 to 2008, 65,000 Falun Gong are harvested for their organs. And again, that's an in-between figure because there's a lower figure, which is about 10,000 approximately, and a high figure, which is close to 120,000. Okay, this is the middle figure. And I think it's interesting because Kilgore and Faddis, who were did the first study on the organ harvesting all the way back in 2006. This is two very, very excellent human rights lawyers. Kilgore's more of a politician, actually, but he was very high up in Canada's diplomatic circles. Faddis is a absolutely bang up human rights lawyer and refugee lawyer. Now, the two of them came up with an estimate based on discrepancies within the Chinese figures themselves, which basically said from 2001 to 2005, 42,000 Falun Gong were harvested. Now, I have a problem with sort of cherry picking into Chinese numbers. I think Chinese numbers are made up. I think most people watching this COVID-19 charade play out will agree with me. I don't think that's a controversial statement these days. That's been true for a long time. So I always had a bit of a problem with their number until I came up with my own, which was based on witnesses, which was based on a survey, a field survey method.
Right.
Then I felt like, well, gee, it's sort of interesting that we're kind of in the same ballpark here, because we were.
Well, I hear you when you say 65,000 is, I think you said not that much. And I know we're speaking, as we always do when we're dealing with horrifying subjects, we speak antiseptically, which doesn't make them any less horrifying. But I get it that 65,000, when you're talking about, a gulag system, a Laogai system with 5 million people, 65,000 over a period of years is not that much relatively. But
That's
still,
right.
it's one hell of a lot of people. What is happening to the organs from 65,000 people? Let's just take that as a number. I mean, I get
Well,
it.
first of all, the organ trade is still pretty primitive. So largely in the beginning of that, when they first start harvesting those organs, it's really one organ from one person. Okay, it's not several organs. They may take the organs out, but they really didn't have a very good system and to kind of move things around and get people in place to receive the organs, if you follow me.
Right.
They didn't have it. It wasn't very centralized. It was actually, the organs were done through kind of an eBay system initially between hospitals. Uh, isn't that something? I mean, it was.
Yeah,
It really was.
that's terrible, but I understand what you're
Yeah,
saying.
it is terrible. It's interesting. Dee Kirsten-Tatlow of the New York Times, who was, just a fantastic reporter when she was still with the New York Times there. Her Chinese was flawless, and she got interested in this issue and it was more on the sort of train schedule. She couldn't figure out how they could move these things around, but she knew they were moving them around. And that was what drew her attention initially to this issue. So that many years later, I came to her and sort of said, "What are you ever going to do a story on this?" Right? And that's a whole nother story on our conversation that day.
Right.
But I'll leave that aside. I think the interesting thing here is to say, okay, let's just concentrate on this. We know that they're taking one organ initially, maybe just a kidney or a liver, because those are the main operations at that time. We know that the transplant industry then goes crazy. Okay, so here's your capitalism, here's your money. It finally comes in. That becomes its own impetus. Initially, it's just the military hospitals who are allowed to do this. Yes? But over time, it becomes clear that some civilian hospitals start doing it as well. And once a few of them have done it, everybody jumps on board. And then suddenly transplant wings are growing up in every major hospital in every major province in China. At the same time, they're getting much better. They're suddenly doing lung transplants. They're doing heart transplants. So we don't know exactly how that worked. We know that it took them about 3 years every time to sort of get the lungs going and make sure everybody could do those right, and then and so forth, and then get the heart and so forth. So that's at the same time. Most of these are obviously going to Chinese people because there's a huge backlog, a huge amount of people who have bad lungs in China, especially with the terrible pollution. There's a lot of people with failing livers and people with weak hearts. Now, but there's also a thriving trade in coming in from overseas, and largely that's Japanese, that's Taiwanese, and that's South Korean. So, and they all do it differently. Okay, the Japanese are doing it. They do it like a big tour group. Where the person's got the flag and everybody follows them around with that little
Yeah.
flag. Yeah, well, it's kind of like that. That's the Japanese don't like to negotiate in China, so they set up their own hospital with China. It was called the China-Japan Friendship Hospital. It's still there. They still use it. And they serve Japanese food in the hospital and so forth. So everybody's comfortable, and the Japanese pay a very high price. The South Koreans, it was done through hospital to hospital. Okay, so hospitals are arranging it for the South Koreans, and we know that because that's been intercepted. With the Taiwanese, they don't need any organ brokers. Okay, they speak Chinese, so they have the organ broker there is Google, right? They just Google various hospitals and they show up. And there, to some extent, uh, we do have some insights into that there were a couple of doctors who were working as organ brokers or at least go-betweens. And I'm not going to talk about that today because that leads us down a huge and very controversial path that is still very controversial in Taiwan. Uh, but there's also, we know in Germany, they're starting to pick up on this. There's a close relationship between a couple of German heart surgeons. They made friendships in China, and they start becoming the conduit from Germany. Mm. America and Canada, yes, but not so much, although we don't have good numbers on this. And we know that Israel, in the beginning, was a major player in terms of organ tourism because they had an HMO system. Yeah, everybody really has to be a part of an HMO. And the HMOs were very generous and said, we will pay for it if you need to go to China and get an organ. Okay. And that is what led eventually down the road in 2008, Israel bans HMOs from doing this. And they're the first country to actually pull up the reins and say, we can't be involved
So
in this.
this, listening to you, I mean, talk about this. This is a horror movie. I mean, I know that's not a revelation to you. You've been studying this for years, but this is now nations feeding off of the organs taken out of people that have been arrested, killed, dismembered, essentially because they don't refuse to follow the belief system of the Communist Party of China.
That is correct.
And yet the world is kind of, I don't want to get too vivid here, but I mean, or too enamored with my own analogy, but it's there's sort of what now we have Taiwanese and Japanese and Americans and Canadians and Israelis kind of crowding around the corpse like, I need the lungs, I need the heart. This is how. So we're talking now what I think you've called 2 this organ harvesting 2.0.
This is 2.0.
So
Yeah.
this takes us through what year?
Here we're getting we're getting almost to the present day. We're getting to about 2014, 2015, because they don't actually come up with a new system during that time. This is the building. This is the construction. This is when the software, everybody starts using that software, if you follow me, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it becomes the standard thing. In fact, I mean, what's odd about this, let's just look at it maybe as an intelligence guy, I think you'll kind of appreciate this. I mean, what's the biggest mystery for me was not, okay, well, why are they doing this at this point? It's like, no, the money's really good, and these are enemies of the state. They're the number one enemies of the state. Falun Gong was considered the biggest issue in China at the time. So if you killed Falun Gong, you were doing a good thing, especially these hardcore members of it. And they were also starting to, by the way, in 2002, they start going after some house Christians. The Church of Almighty God, sometimes called Eastern Lightning, that group starts being included. And in 2003, you get the Tibetans for the first time. So Tibetan monks are also being harvested. A lot of this is just opportunistic. And it started to build its own momentum because you do have these transplant centers and you do have these trained surgeons, and they want to use this. They want to make this, they want to see the big money. Because we are talking about big money here. We're talking about, in today's terms, we're talking about 150,000 for each lung. We're talking about 90,000 for a kidney. Well, actually more like 75 or 70 or so around there for a kidney, but both kidneys, and 90 to 100,000 for a liver, and 150,000 to 175,000 for the heart. These are U.S. dollars. I mean, these are extraordinary sums when we're talking about organ tourists from abroad, right? Which is why they're only waiting 2 weeks for an organ at this point. And that's not true anywhere else in the world. And of course, and by the end of around 2008, in fact, right after there's a brief lull during the Olympics where they stopped selling this to foreign organ tourists for a while. They sort of clean up the country, and then it comes back. When it comes back, that's when you start getting these emergency liver operations, where somebody comes in with an acute liver crisis and 4 hours later they have a new liver. Now, this is impossible to do unless you have a stable of people, a stable of tissue types. So you can match that tissue type to order and perform the operation and have it encased in the person that quickly. There's no other way to do this, right? And it's being done across the country. So you can see how this has exploded, and yeah, it is a bit. It's very much like a horror movie. But what's bizarre about this, I just want to say this is very important. This is what should China have been doing theoretically? What is the way China is supposed to make money in the medical field in the modern world? I think it's obvious to everybody. Pharmaceuticals. I mean, China's supposed to be number one in pharmaceuticals because they don't have a FDA. They can clear these things very fast. They have a big captive population they can test on. A lot of Western companies have already used that. Companies like Pfizer have done testing in China because it's so much cheaper, and you can get away with things you can't get away with in the West. That's where the future lies for them. That's the pillar industry. But where's the immediate money? The immediate money's in harvesting.
When I hear you talk about the scope of this, I'm going to make a statement, and I want you to tell me if you think it's justified or not. I mean, because what I'm hearing is by this point in time, with the scope, by this point in time, I mean coming to the end of the period we're talking about today, which is where we are in the conversation. By this point in time, given the scope, the scale, the number of people traveling to China, the speed with which organs are delivered, which you've pointed out, you're murdering people to take their organs out to transplant into somebody. You're not just fortuitously have so many people in captivity that they drop dead so regularly that you can do this. I mean, is that too strong?
No, that is not too strong. In fact, I'd make it a little stronger.
Okay.
Do you know what the average age of, according to the Chinese documents, and that's been very revealing. We only got this really in the last 3 or 4 years. But according to Chinese internal chatter about this, which isn't really chatter, I mean, it's published stuff in their own journals and so forth, the average age is about 28. In other words, they're harvesting people at age 28. Well, nobody dies. Very few people die at age 28 of anything.
Right.
It's incredibly rare, and it's a great tragedy, of course, when it happens. This is one of the reasons why COVID-19 is being taken so seriously, is because we've actually seen some horrible cases of that kind of thing, with stroke and so forth. And they're very few and far between. But in China, they're apparently happening all the time, because the way they write this up is, oh, we have a 20 to 28-year-old with heart failure. All right? That's nearly impossible. Nor is the drug addiction in China anywhere near what it should be to justify this as a sort of, junkies.
Right. Well, and of course, that would also raise the issue of the more we go down the road of it just happens to be a 28-year-old with massive health problems, the more we go in the direction of, in that case, their organs are highly unlikely to be suitable.
Exactly. And in fact, they say that in many cases that there's actually no history of any heart problems.
Right. This incredible.
The heart is good. They died of something, a heart attack or some sort of heart failure, but their heart is good. There's no pulmonary issues, and they go on to harvest those people, and they're clearly live organ harvesting. Okay, there's no question. We've already set that up in organ harvesting.
We talked about that before, and just to clarify, if there's somebody listening who didn't listen to the first episode, that means exactly what it sounds like it means. It means you're taking the organs out while the person's still alive.
Right, and the delay in getting it to the new patient is being put down usually in the case studies as 0 or 5 minutes. Okay, which means you have the two people, practically right next to each other, maybe probably for decency's sake, one is in the other room. They're heavily sedated. Not too heavily sedated because that ruins the organ and makes it sluggish, but you are cutting out that organ and then you are rushing it right in, you know, immediately and
So
putting
I
it
mean,
into
we're coming to the close of this episode, running out of time. But again, just for emphasis here, I guess. Okay, all of this that you're laying out here, given the scope of what's happening and all of the factors that you have done a superb job of delineating, has to be in 2015 or wherever we're ending this, crystal clear to all of the medical professionals, hospitals, HMOs, and countries that are cooperating and sending their citizens off from Japan or the United States or Israel for this transplant. I mean, they are all, in some sense, complicit because you have to know as a matter of common sense that you're going there, you're sending this person there, doctor, to get a transplant, and they're going to execute somebody, or actually not execute him, they're going to rip his organs out and then kill him to
that's right.
effect this transplant. And yet we are going to just go along with this. All over the world, we're gonna allow this to go on. Um,
This is one of the greatest failures, the greatest failure, really, at least in this century, of the Western medical world. Uh, it's devastating. It's truly tragic. And they have tried to make up for it. We can talk about that next time a little bit, but they've tried to make up for it by kind of saying, well, we don't want to offend China, so we want to handle this quietly. You know, we recognize something's going on here and it's wrong, but we need to negotiate that very carefully and just leave it to us. Uh, so this is what we're seeing very much. I mean, anybody who doesn't believe that, all they have to do is look at the WHO. Does anyone really believe that the World Health Organization really thought it was a good idea to hold back this information about COVID-19? But they did it, clearly, right? They understood what was going on. There was no way they could have. These are very professionals. They understood it, but they didn't want to rock the boat. So we've seen this happen just recently again. The tragedy here is that this was going on for years. And they had so many chances to kind of stand up, blow the whistle, and so forth. They didn't do it. Now, the final thing, and I just want to leave this as a sort of teaser for organ harvesting 3.0, is there is a problem developing in Chinese circles, harvesting circles at this point in the transplant industry, which is they are starting to run out of Falun Gong. And that's where I want to leave that. That's around the time my book comes out in 2014, 2015. We're starting to see some signs of that, a slowing down of the construction rate of new transplant centers for the first time. And a lot of the Westerners who want to look at this optimistically, doctors, are sort of saying, okay, maybe they're reforming. Maybe that's what this means. But I think we can see in the
yeah.
next time that we're entering you call this science fiction. The last chapter is perhaps the most science fiction chapter of them all.
Ethan, I think that's a perfect place to leave it. Thank you for teeing it up like that, and thank you for being with us today.
All right. Thank you, Sam.
And thank you for listening. We'll talk to you next time on Ground Truth.